Powiedz kojarzę. So let's start today's class. we will do the residential status of individual. So first, we will understand what is residential status and why it is important. What is to be done with the residential status and how it works in terms of taxability of any person. I hope I'm audible now. Because income tax is levied as per the residential status only. Only the Indian resident persons need to pay tax. You cannot ask Barack Obama to pay tax in India because he is not an Indian resident. So who will define or how it will be defined that who is resident? You cannot ask all nations, persons of the world to pay tax in India. And you cannot actually skip anyone who come to India, earn something and go out of India. For example, Google is providing services in India, Facebook is providing services in India, and they are earning good amount from India. They must pay tax in India. But Google and Facebook, do they live in India? Do they have an offices in India? Probably yes. But in earlier time, initially when they started, probably no. Or even there are many companies who are earning good amount from India, but they don't have any office in India. Then in that case, whether they have to pay tax in India or not. So that is the case will be decided according to the residential status. That who will pay tax in India and who will not pay tax in India. Taxability arises as per the residential status of any individual. There are two types of residential status and two subtype of residential status. Total four types. So two types are non-resident and resident. A person can be resident in India or it can be non-resident in India. In resident, there can be two subtypes. He can be ordinary resident, he can be not ordinary resident. So there are total four types of residential status. Let's start with the first one. Resident in India. So who will be considered as resident in India? Any one conditions should be satisfied. Any person who satisfies any one of these conditions. Condition number one, he lived in India for minimum 182 days during the previous year. We know what is previous year, the year starting from 1st April to 31st March. So any year which we are talking about, from that 1st April to 31st March, he must lived in India for minimum 182 days or more. Then he would be considered as resident in India. Or what is the second condition? He lived in India, he stayed in India for minimum 60 days during previous year. Plus, not just one condition, but there are second condition also. In previous 4 years, He stayed in India for minimum 365 days in total. So preceding 4 years, he lived in India for 365 days, plus he lived in India for 60 days in the last current year, previous year. So preceding previous 4 years, he lived for 365 days, and previous year he lived 60 days. Then he will be considered as resident in India. Or he lived for 182 days in India, he will be considered as resident in India. So any one condition should be satisfied. It's or either this or this. Any of this condition should be satisfied. Either he lived for 182 days, done. Or he lived for 60 days, but he also lived for 365 days for previous 4 years. In the following cases, condition 2(1) will be 182 days. That means the minimum 60 days condition will become 182 days. A citizen who leaves India for employment outside India. A citizen who leaves India as a crew member of Indian ship. A citizen who leaves India as a crew member of foreign bound ship. So in nutshell, if any Indian citizen leaves India for employment outside India, he must he must he must be in India for 182 days. Otherwise, he will not be resident. 60 days condition does not apply. 182 days condition will be applied. So in the following cases, condition 2(1) will be 182 days. If you leave India for employment outside India, or as a crew member of Indian ship, or as a crew member of foreign bound ship. In the following cases, condition 2(1) will be 120 days. An Indian citizen or a person of origin of India, an Indian citizen or a person of Indian origin or person of origin country as India visits India. Suppose you're a person who is living in USA, but his forefathers lived in India, so he is a person of Indian origin. POI. He visits India. He visits India. He stays in India for 60 days. He stays for 365 days in 4 years. He satisfied second condition. Will he be resident in India? No. He must be India for minimum 120 days to become resident in India. So I'll recapitulate this last para. If I'm an Indian citizen or I'm a person whose forefathers were from India and I visit India and I earn more than 15 lakh Indian income, then in that case, I cannot be resident in India unless I serve minimum 120 days in India. And yes, if I have not been in India for 182 days, then I'll fall in second condition. And then in second condition, I have to serve minimum 120 days in India. And then 4 years, minimum 365 days in India. then only I will be resident in India. There is one more case, deemed resident. So you are resident. Now it is deemed resident. Even if you are not resident, we will deem you as a resident. So what does it mean by deemed? Even if you are not resident, we will consider you as resident. For example, let me take an amazing example. You are a male. You are a male. But if you wear female clothes, you keep long hairs, you do all the makeup, and you wear the female clothes, you will be deemed to be female. You're not a male, you're not a female, but you will be deemed to be female. You are a male, obviously you are a male. But if you wear everything like a female, people will consider you as female. They will treat you like a female. So that is what deemed word. It will be deemed resident. You're not a resident. You're definitely not a resident. But you will be deemed resident when, if you are an Indian citizen, plus your total Indian income is more than 15 lakh, plus you're not paying tax in any country. You're enjoying your income. You're enjoying your income. You're earning lakhs of money. You're not paying tax anywhere in any country. Indian government will not allow you to do that. Why? Because you are an Indian citizen. If you are an Indian citizen, your income is more than 15 lakh, you're not paying tax anywhere in the world. You have to pay tax in India. You will be deemed resident in India. So what does it mean by Indian income? So Indian income means income which is accrued in India, which is deemed accrued in India, or which is received in India, is Indian income. What is not an Indian income? Excluding what? Accrued or received outside India. That's not an Indian income. So that's the basic meaning of Indian income. Now, what is ordinary resident? You are a resident. Now, subtype is there. This is a subtype that you are an ordinary resident. So who will be ordinary resident? Sorry, there was some issue. So, what is ordinary resident? So, resident had two types, I just told. One is ordinary and one is not ordinary. So, once you are a resident, then we will see whether you are ordinary resident or not ordinary resident. In general sense, just think about one thing, because I always tell you one thing. Every tax provision has a reason or logic behind it. So what is ordinary and not ordinary? Simple, as the meaning suggests. If you are ordinary, live in India, you are an ordinary resident. If you are not ordinary, live in India, you are a not ordinary resident. Simple. There is no difference, no simplicity. So if you normally live in India, you are an ordinary resident. You, me, every one of you is resident and ordinary resident, because we ordinarily live in India. But your some relative who don't live in India, who come occasionally to India, so they might be resident. If they spend 182 days in India for any reason, suppose someone came in March 2020 to India and stuck in India due to COVID. Now they lived in India for 182 days. They would be resident in India, but they would not be ordinary resident, because they are not normally living in India. They lived in India for some reason, for that year exceptionally. So they are not ordinary resident. So who are ordinary? Who ordinarily lives in India. Who are not ordinary? Who ordinarily do not live in India. Now what is the condition? What is the exact provision? In previous 10 years, minimum 2 years you were resident in India. Plus, and now just think, in the last condition, in the resident condition, the condition was or. It was written any one of the condition. So any one of the condition, if you satisfied, you would become resident. But here it is end. That means you have to satisfy both the conditions, not just one. So you must be resident in India for 2 years in last 10 years. You must be in India for 730 days in last 7 years. You have to satisfy both the conditions. If both the conditions are satisfied, you are ordinary resident. Otherwise, you are not ordinary resident. Simple. Just look at the previous slide. You have to satisfy any one of the condition, either this or this. You have to satisfy any one of the conditions, or is written. But here you must satisfy both the conditions if you really want to be ordinary resident. Otherwise, you will be not ordinary resident. Now, how to recognize residential status of HUF, firm or AOP? We have studied residential status of individual, who can be resident, who can be non-resident. In resident, who can be ordinary resident, who can be not ordinary resident. Because if you are not resident, if you are non-resident, you cannot be resident, ordinary resident or not ordinary resident. You are non-resident means you are non-resident. If you are resident, you can be ordinary resident, you can be not ordinary resident. Are you clear? Now, residential status of HUF, firm or AOP, BOI, etc. If the control and management is in India, if the control and management is in India, then you are a resident. Suppose the firm's maximum partner sits in India, it will be resident in India because the control and management which is being done by partners of the firm is in India. That means it's a resident. What I've written here is the language of law. The law says if the control and management is not outside India, that means in India. So the control and management is not outside India, or I would say in India, then it is resident. Not non-resident, if control and management is wholly outside India, completely outside India, that means it is non-resident. Now only for HUF, ordinary resident, non-ordinary resident. In firm and AOP cases, just resident or non-resident. There is no such case of ordinary or not ordinary. But in case of HUF, if the karta of the HUF, now who is karta? The head of family. What is HUF? Hindu undivided family. So the head of family, if he satisfied both two conditions, which two conditions? These two, 10 years and 7 years condition. So the 10 years and 7 years condition, 10 years out of 10 years, 2-year resident, and out of 7 years, 730 days in India. Both satisfied by karta of the family, the head of the family, then it will be ordinary resident. Otherwise, it will be not ordinary resident. The last but not the least, residential status of company, private limited company or a limited company. In private limited company, an Indian company is always resident in India. If you are an Indian company, you are resident in India. Nothing to be seen. Or even if you are a foreign company, but your place of effective management is in India, you are a resident. Any company whose place of effective management is in India is a resident in India. Otherwise, non-resident. Now, what is place of effective management? The key managerial persons stays in India. The directors of the company stays in India. All the commercial decisions of the company are taken in India. That means the place of effective management, POEM, is in India. KMP means key managerial persons, director, managers, CEO, CFO, these are KMPs. If they are in India, it's a resident company because they only take the decisions. Or if the decisions are taken in India, it's a resident company. So this is done for today. We will study income exempted from tax tomorrow. We have completed the residential status. If there are any doubts, you can ask me till 6 p.m.